Hello, everybody. This is Mike from the Hey, Are You Still There podcast. My wife Beth and I would like to invite you to join us each week as we examine life at the intersection of marriage, family, careers, and ministry. Through 28 years of ministry, 26 years of marriage, 23 years of professional careers, and 21 years of being parents to 3 kids, our fun and honest discussions promise to have something for everyone. And now, on to the show. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Hey, Are You Still There podcast. This is Mike, and I am going solo this week. So right now, I can hear all of your mobile devices and computers turning off because I know that Beth is the reason most of you guys tune in, but unfortunately, Beth is not with me today. She and our daughter are away on a little girls' trip. It's our daughter's spring break from college, and so they took a few days together. So it left me and Josh at home by ourselves, where we've had a very peaceful, quiet few days. But I wanted to take advantage of this time of going solo and give an introduction into a topic that Beth and I have mentioned in the past that we'd like to share with you all. And that's the idea of the Enneagram. The Enneagram, quite frankly, has changed my life. The understanding of the Enneagram, what it is, where it comes from. And so when I say our, I mean Beth and my introduction and use of the Enneagram really started accidentally with me. So what I wanted to do is take advantage of just this time of being alone and being able to share with you guys just a quick 30,000 foot flyover of what the Enneagram was and my introduction to the Enneagram. So then when Beth's back and we can sit down and discuss it, this part's already taken care of and we can dive in deep into the different parts of the Enneagram and helping you guys understand the way we have, how impactful this could be and how God uses it to really reveal some parts about your inner motivations. So without further ado, let's jump into the introduction to the Enneagram. My introduction to the Enneagram came out of a period of desperation. It was probably about 7 or 8 years ago now. I'd been in ministry for over 20 years and had really reached a point, not just in ministry, but in life, where I was just feeling completely worn out and wasted and just needed something. And I felt, God was kind of stirring something in my soul to you need to take some spiritual rest. You need to go find somewhere to get refueled. And the idea that he laid on my heart was to try to find some type of Christian spiritual retreat somewhere. And it didn't have to be pastor oriented. It could be just anything where I could go find some rest and peace for my worn out soul. And so I started looking and I ran across an organization based in Tennessee. And I'll be honest, I looked for them. I don't even know if they're still around. I couldn't find any evidence of them right now. But if I do find them, I'll include it on the link when this podcast posts. But they were holding a spiritual retreat, and the name of the retreat was The Road Back to You. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. And so I started reading the description of what was going to happen at the retreat, and it sounded exactly what I needed. And so I went ahead and registered for the retreat, not knowing anything about it, just knowing it was at some small retreat center in the mountains of Tennessee. And I received my confirmation email from the organization, and they let me know, hey, look, we've got a guest speaker coming in. He's written this book. We encourage you to buy the book, to read the book, and we encourage you to take this test on the Enneagram and have it taken before you come. I didn't know any of this. I know it sounds stupid, but I didn't know who this guy was. I had never heard of the Enneagram. I just saw the retreat, felt really led to register for it. And so I was like, all right, well, we can do this. Well, the guy that was coming in leading the retreat was a guy named Ian Cron, who I had never heard of. Come to find out, he's, I believe he's an Episcopal priest. He is an award-winning song. He is a best-selling author. He's, I think, a clinical psychologist. I mean, the guy is just brilliant and has done a lot. And his big passion was the Enneagram. And he had written a book called The Road Back to You. And so I got a copy of the book and started reading it. I couldn't put it down. I was just absolutely blown away. There was, and I'll get to this in a moment, but there was a chapter when he got to this one part of the Enneagram that described me perfectly. It's like he had followed me around for my entire life. And, at that point, I guess I was probably 42, 43. He had followed me around and just took notes of my life and put it in this chapter. Like I felt like it was that real. It rocked my world. So what is the Enneagram? The Enneagram is, I guess we would call it a personality test, maybe, if you want to get it at its most simplest generic form. The word Enneagram, Enne meaning 9 and gram being a picture. And so if you would just kind of picture a big circle. And in this circle, it's numbered 1 through 9, and with lines going all over the place inside of it, with different numbers being connected, for just. That's kind of what it looks like. So you might have the number 9 is connected to number 6, and number 6 is connected to number 3, and 3 goes back up to 9. So it forms like this triangle. And that's kind of how a lot of it is. And, we'll get into what all that means later. But you're basically just picturing a circle. And you can Google this and pull up a picture if you want. But it's a circle with 9 numbers going all the way around it, with 9 being at the 12 o'clock. So kind of, right at the very top, and then working its way around. What these numbers represent, and this was something that they don't really know the foundation of their speculation. There's theories on where the Enneagram come from. They really don't have a locked in time period, but they believe that it could have started as early as around 400 AD. With some things taken from the teachings of Paul, certain priests or rabbis were looking at human nature and human sin nature and motivation, and looking at it through the teachings of Paul's letter. And they kind of come up with this idea, and then it kind of sat there for a while. And then there was a Franciscan monk by the name of Raymond Lull, who, was born, he was around the 12 to 1300s. He started utilizing it extensively in his work as he was working with folks. And it kind of stayed there for a little while. And then kind of the late 1800s, early 1900s, it got picked up again by another guy, where the Enneagram really started to kind of pop up and be formulated into what we know it today. And then in the 1970s, it really took off, and it started being taught in universities and being taught as in an area of psychology and business, just as a way of like some self-awareness, self-development, self-growth, kind of focusing on the sacredness of being transformed, being redeemed, and this spiritual experience with God. It looks into our motivations. Why do we do the things that we do? And Ian does an amazing job in his book, The Road Back to You, to explain it in just layman's terms, where you're reading each chapter, you're reading his intro of what the Enneagram is. And again, that was what I gave you, was just kind of it may be 100,000 foot flyover. It just barely skimmed the surface, but he dives in deep to each number and what each number represents and how it looks like in your day-to-day life. And the idea is that everyone is one of these numbers. Everyone is a 1 or a 2 or a 3. And it kind of goes around the circle. And for some of the numbers, I'll give you, like 1 used to be considered the perfectionist. Now they call it the reformer or the improver. I guess perfectionist kind of got some negative connotations, but it's known as, just the reformer. The number 2 is considered the helper or the caring nurturer. Number 3 is viewed as like a success-oriented person or an achiever. At its worst, is considered a 3 is what they call a chameleon. Somebody that can kind of blend in with any crowd and kind of be what that crowd needs them to be. 4s are the sensitive creators. 5 are perceptive observers. 6 are considered responsible. They are askers, as I would call. They question a lot of things. 7. 7 is kind of this joyful enthusiast, kind of the life of the party. 8, they're known as kind of strong challengers, kind of not afraid to step up, in your face, pit bull type personalities. And then number 9s, they're known as the peacemakers. They're easygoing. That's kind of their, and all of these things are motivations. All of these things is, why do you do what you do? So I'm reading this book, and it's a question I had never asked myself. I've done a lot of things. Obviously, being in ministry, I do a lot of things for other people, but I never asked myself why. And so as I'm reading The Road Back to You, and I'm reading chapter 1, or chapter on ones, I knew that's who I was. Without even taking the test, I knew I was a 1. I was a perfectionist. I was principled. I was this reformer. I was this improver. Like, that's what motivates me to do what I do, is kind of that pursuit of excellence and that perfectionism. And as I read, 2s and 3s and 4s, all of a sudden I started thinking about other people in my life, from my own family to my friends, to members of my church, to people from my past. I was like, oh, I can see them as this. I can see them as this. And knowing that, just through knowing them intimately, or knowing through counseling or talking to them and conversations, that this is their motivation. This is why they do what they do. So I finished the book, devoured it, and went and took the test. And sure enough, overwhelmingly, I was a 1. That's what I am. I'm a perfectionist, a principal, reformer, improver. That's who I was. So I was so excited to get this retreat. And in my mind, I guess I had built up that this Enneagram retreat was going to be a couple hundred people. We were going to be sitting in an auditorium, and Ian was going to be up there leading this lecture. So I left that Friday morning. I drove into Tennessee, pulled up to the retreat center, just a beautiful retreat center tucked away in the mountains of Tennessee. I'm not even sure I could find it again without having to do some deep dives into Google Maps. It was just really tucked away. And so I go in, I check in, I have a little room there at the retreat center, and then they announce, hey, dinner's going to be at 6, and everyone's going to eat, and then we'll go into our first session. So I show up and I go to dinner, and it's kind of a long table, and people are starting to come in and sit down, and it's set up kind of family style. And I thought, man, this is going to take forever to eat with all these people here. Well, I was wrong. It was not a lot of people. There was just 12 of us and Ian. That was it. So 13 of us at this retreat, including Ian. I didn't know Ian from Adam. I didn't know what he looked like. I didn't know anything about him. And so I just take a place and I sit down at the table, and this guy comes up and asks if he can sit beside me. And he's, thin, balding, glasses, a little older than me, t-shirt, jeans with holes in them, sandals or flip-flops. I mean, he just looked like a cool, normal dude. I was like, yeah, man, have a seat. And so he sat down next to me. Everybody else sat down, and we just shared a meal together. And like I said, we ate family style. We passed food around. And the guy was very inquisitive. He was asking us all these questions about our lives, so much that we never really got to ask him any questions, and which I like. I mean, it was kind of neat. I thought, man, this guy's kind of bold. He seemed very interested in who we were. So we finished dinner. We go into this little meeting area where there's literally 12 chairs sitting around in a semicircle, with one chair kind of at the opening. And we all go in and we sit down, and yeah, you can see where this is going. The guy in jeans and a t-shirt and sandals goes and sits down in the one chair at the opening. I had sat beside Ian that night at dinner and had no idea who he was. And so Ian introduces himself and tells us a little bit about his life and who he is and his involvement in the Enneagram. And we go around and share who we are. And I went in, I assumed a lot of things that are wrong. I assumed that most of the folks there were probably going to be in some type of full-time vocational ministry like myself. There was only one other guy out of the 12 of us, and that guy was actually on sabbatical and confessed he didn't know if he was going back or not to ministry. Everyone else was from all kinds of walks of life. They were all believers, but they were everything from a stay-at-home parent to working in the corporate world to running nonprofits. I mean, it was a little bit of everything along the spectrum. So we go around, we tell about ourselves, and then he has us go around and share our numbers. And out of the 12 of us, I was the only one that was a 1. So that night he goes into, after we finish kind of introductions and sharing about ourselves and why we're there and all that kind of thing, he goes into kind of the session is all about the Enneagram. What is the Enneagram? Where did it come from? Why is it useful? And he shares all of this, which is kind of a little bit of a repeat from his book, but it was good to hear it from him. It was good to hear it from the source, the man who wrote the book on the Enneagram. And I went to bed that night just excited. And I didn't know why. I just felt like this is exactly where I needed to be. I don't know why, but I felt like this is where God wanted me. And so I woke up the next morning again, ready to go. So he had the sessions that Saturday, broke up into 3 sessions. And Beth and I will get into this. We're not going to dive deep into this, but the Enneagram, being 9 numbers, is broke up into 3 triads, where a grouping of 3 numbers kind of go together. There's the heart triad, the head triad, and the gut triad. And, they all kind of, you might be different numbers, but you may all fit and share kind of a heart or a head or a gut feeling with 2 other numbers. And so the very first one he started with was the gut triad, which is 8, 9s, and 1s. So he started talking about 8s, and anybody who was 8s shared about being an 8. And then he went into the 9s. He talked about 9s, and everyone that was there shared about being a 9 and what it was like being the peacemaker. And then he got to the 1s, and he was like, there was only one, right? And he looked around and he was like, it was you. And I'm like, yeah, it's me. And he's like, all right. And he's like, well, what do you do for a living again? And he's like, did you say you were a pastor? And I was like, yeah, I'm a pastor. And Ian just kind of sat back in his chair and he's like, I'm going to be honest with you. He was like, you may be the first pastor I've ever met that's a 1. He said most pastors are 3s or 9s. He's like, most pastors are that peacemaker, the 9. They're easygoing. They're the peacemaker. That's kind of who they are and their motivation for doing things. Or they're 3s. 3s being that success-oriented achiever chameleon that can walk into a room and feel the temperature of the room and morph into whatever that room needs, which makes sense. As he said that, 99% of all the pastors I know fall into one of those 2 categories. And so he said, look, since you're the only one, I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but can you and I just talk and let everyone else just eavesdrop? He's like, I'm fascinated by this. And I was like, man, I'm an open book. And I am. I am transparent as I can humanly be. And I was like, yeah, that's fine. I don't know these people. I don't care what they think about me. So he starts asking me questions, digging into, I guess, trying to figure out if I was really a 1. And the thing that I remember, this is what kind of started the process of my life being changed, is he asked me, he said, do you ever hear any negative thoughts in your head? Now, this is a trait. If you get a chance to read The Road Back to You, or you read Richard Rohr, who is another amazing author, he wrote The Sacred Enneagram, a little bit more headier than The Road Back to You. I think Richard falls in line with a C.S. Lewis, somebody like that. That's a Tim Keller. That's a little bit headier than I like to be. I feel like The Road Back to You is a lot more practical. And maybe it's, I don't want to say dumbed down because it's a brilliant book, but I could understand it easier than Richard's book. But in these books, it talks about this negative voice that ones hear, that's the thing that drives their perfection, is that there's this voice that tells you You're not good enough. You're not doing enough. What you're doing is a bad job. You're a terrible employee. You're a terrible father. You're a terrible mother. You're a terrible parent. You're a terrible pastor. You're a terrible friend. I mean, it can just go on. You name it. And ones have this voice that just never shuts up. And so for me, I can't remember a time in my life where I did not have that voice. Now, Ian is quick to point out that a lot of people may have a negative voice that pops up, but some of it is nurture and some of it's nature. Ones have it by nature. Ones have had that negative voice since they could first think. Others might have that negative voice based on nurturing. You might have a parent or a coach or a teacher or a boss that, fill you with this negativity. One of my favorite TV shows is The Bear. And I think about Carmy, and Carmy's the lead in the show, and he's this brilliant chef. But there's all these flashbacks to this one head chef that he used to work under that just nothing but negative. And it kind of is what motivates and pushes Carmy to be a great chef. And I think that's the nurture. That's the people in your life that speaks. And what Ian would say is, does the negative voice have a voice? When you hear a negative voice, does it sound like your mom? Does it sound like your dad? Does it sound like your spouse? Does it sound like a coach? Because if that has a voice, then they nurture into you. But for me, I didn't have that. I had loving parents. I had great parents. I never really had any coaches or teachers or a spouse that, would talk down to me or not build me up. And being a Christian and being called into ministry, what the enemy did is he made me believe that negative voice in my head was from God. And so I never felt good enough as a follower of Jesus. I always felt like my sin was worse than any sin in the world, that any time I sinned, that it disqualified me from being a pastor. And, being a pastor, and obviously if you're a pastor, there's people in your church. It created this people pleaser where I felt like I needed to make everybody happy. I needed to say yes to everybody, even to my detriment or the detriment of my family, because it needed to be done with perfection. I needed to be the perfect pastor for people to like me. I needed to be the perfect husband for my wife to love me. I needed to be the perfect father. And when I wasn't perfect, because God knows none of us are, I would just beat myself up and I would get so angry at myself and feel like such a failure. And then you end up most of the time lashing out or doing something that you regret. And it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then you do feel like I have failed, and you've failed in that area. And so it became this cycle where in my mind, I was driven by this negative voice that I associated with God. And so he asked me, he said, do you hear a negative voice? And I said, man, I wake up with a negative voice and I go to bed with a negative voice. And Ian said, well, what's it telling you? And I shared exactly what I just shared with you, all the negative thoughts. And you could hear a pin drop. And Ian said, look around the room. And I looked around the room at these other 11 people, and they were sitting there with their mouth open. A couple of them had tears in their eyes. And Ian said, he said, all the other numbers, 2 through 9, are shocked to hear ones have this negative voice. And ones are shocked nobody else does. And he asked the rest of the group, he's like, do you have these kind of negative thoughts? And they were all like, no. And they admitted that when they do have negative thoughts, it does come from a place of nurturing. None of them just had it naturally. And he's like, that's a 1. That's that perfectionist. That's that reformer, that improver. He said, the great thing about being a 1 is that you do strive for excellence, that it does push you to do things the best you possibly can be. But you're letting the fear of failure motivate you when you're on the negative side of that. So then he asked me 2 questions that changed my life forever. He asked me, he said, all right, so you're a pastor. Tell me what your church loves about you. And I'd never thought about it. And I was like, well, I think my church loves this and this. And I started naming all 3 or 4 things. And he stopped me. He said, no. That's not what I'm asking. He's like, you're telling me what your church loves that you do for them. I mean, that's what a perfectionist and a number 1 does. He or she does for others in, I'm going to do this with perfection. He said, you're telling me what your church loves that you do for them. Why do they love you? I said, I can't answer that. I don't know. He said, all right. He said, well, why do you love you? And I had never thought about that in my life. I had never even considered that I could love myself, because honestly, I didn't love myself. I looked at my life and decisions that I made, and every small sin was amplified to a big sin, and every big sin was amplified in my mind to an unforgivable sin. And man, I just sat back and I was like, I don't know why I love myself. And Ian said, you will never quiet the voices in your head until you figure out why you love yourself and allow you to love yourself. And when you figure that out, you're going to know why others love you also. And then Ian goes, all right, time for lunch. And that was it. Like literally that was it. It just ended right there. We prayed and went and ate lunch. The morning session was over. And I'll be honest, I don't even remember the rest of that retreat. I don't remember the rest of the sessions. I know that when we came back, we kind of went into the next triad, which was like the 2, 3, 4s. And we went into the next session, which was a 5, 6, 7s. And, that night we did some stuff. I think we did communion or something. I don't know. Sunday morning we got up and had breakfast and had a closing session, but it was a blur. Because all I could think about was those 2 questions. Why does my church love me? Or why do people love me? And why do I love myself? Ian talked to me later that weekend and about that a little bit more one-on-one. And he told me, he said, look, this negative voice has driven you to be successful. He's like, I have no doubt you're probably a fairly successful and driven pastor and minister. And he said, but that negative voice has also been very detrimental to you. And he was like, you need to start when you hear that negative voice. Just tell that negative voice, thanks. I appreciate all you've done for me up to this point, but I don't need you anymore. He goes, you got to give yourself permission to not be perfect. And we talked a little bit about, things around the house, and he said, you're probably the guy that no one can fill the dishwasher but you. And I'm like, yeah, that's exactly. And he said, well, let somebody else fill the dishwasher. He's like, you're probably the guy that when laundry's done, you want it put away immediately. Yeah. Let laundry pile up. And he started naming off just little things like that around the house, around my day-to-day life that he had seen in other ones, this perfectionist. And he said, go home and start being less than perfect and see what happens. And it was hard. I mean, I went home and it took everything within me not to constantly clean house, not to constantly have everything straight. I used to love our house. I used to say, I want our house kept that if we put it on the market for sale, people could start seeing it today. Like I was that. And I would say it was OCD, but really it was my perfectionism. I felt like it needed to be perfect because if it was perfect, people would love me and maybe God would love me. And it was hard. But slowly I started letting stuff go. Slowly I started letting stuff be less than perfect. Slowly the voices started to get a little bit quieter. And I would, every time I would hear that voice, I would say, hey, thanks, but I don't need you anymore. And as those voices started to quiet, I started to really dig into this self-reflection of why do I love myself and why do others love me? And what I came up with was this. I really believe people love me because I'm genuine. And I love myself because I'm genuine. There's nothing phony about me. What you see is what you get. The mic that you get on the podcast is the same mic that you're going to get if you come to our church and sit in the congregation. It's the same mic you're going to get if you go play disc golf or board games with me. It's the same mic you're going to get on vacation. This is me. And some people love that, and some people don't. But I truly believe in my heart, I love myself because I'm genuine. And I think that's why people love me. But I never would have discovered that had it not been for the Enneagram. Understanding that this perfection that I thought was, man, I don't know, a weight that I had to carry, I didn't have to carry. That the negative voice I was hearing was not from God, but it was from the enemy hijacking my sense to be an improver or a reformer. So that's it. That's the Enneagram. That's my intro. That's my story. I am passionate about the Enneagram. And when Beth comes back and we're able to sit down and dive in, we'll dive into the nuts and bolts. She'll talk about what her number is, what that means, and we'll go through each number. And we might break it up into 3 more episodes. Maybe we'll hit a triad each episode. But that's it. That's the Enneagram. So I encourage you that if you've never read a book about the Enneagram, I highly encourage you to read Ian Cron's book, The Road Back to You. He has a podcast, which is one of the top podcasts in the country called Typology. I encourage you to listen to that. He puts out weekly episodes. There's tests. You can pay for a test if you want. I think there's some free tests online. You can go take an Enneagram test and see what you are. But for me, it was eye-opening. For me, it was life-changing. God used the Enneagram to change my life. And I am passionate about it, and I love it, and I think you will too. So that's our special podcast for today. I guess we'll call this Enneagram Part 1, the introduction, Mike's story. So until next time for Part 2, go do some homework. Go check out the Enneagram. See what you think. And I will see you later.